There's an unspoken rule up in the mountains that no matter who you are, friend, bitter rival, stranger, anyone, if you're ever in a pinch and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone to speak to in the winter months especially. You'd be hard-pressed to see another soul for weeks, sometimes even months. But that's the rule. You need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. Now, I'm not a burly seasoned mountain man that flosses with tree bark and never shaves, but I do like to hunt. I often leave my small Alaskan village for weeks at a time and take to my hunting lodge up in the mountains. I'm a fairly cautious guy, and I know the mountains can be traitorous, so when I leave prepared. I check the long-term forecasts and gather the necessary supplies, bring backups, and make sure I've got enough of everything that I need to survive at least a week longer than I plan on staying, just in case. I always believed that my precautions would protect me, but like a child's security blanket, they were only a paper-thin illusion of safety. There's really no planning when Mother Nature decides she's in a mood. That's why I never expected to get caught in a blizzard this day. It had started out sunny and cold, but as the day progressed, a few clouds formed. By the time they had massed into a heavy cloud covering, I was already on my way back to my cabin, with a couple of hairs hanging over my shoulders. I'd named them dinner and breakfast. I was planning on eating breakfast for dinner and dinner for breakfast, if only to make myself laugh. It's the little things like that that keep solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had knocked an awning shut and all the snow collected on top had fallen all at once. Except it wasn't a single tidal wave of snow, it was a relentless, unending assault. Last I checked, the weather reports hadn't mentioned a blizzard, and yet a blizzard was what I found myself walking through. It got very dark, very fast, and I kicked myself for leaving my flashlight back at my lodge. I'd planned on coming home long before nightfall, so I hadn't thought I needed it. I'd been sorely mistaken. Snow prickled painfully as it darted into my eyes. I had squinted almost all the way to keep those sub-zero jerks from stabbing me blind. The wind howled as gales cut through my clothes and right to my bones. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, and I couldn't see the 2 feet beneath me as they sank in an ever-growing blanket of white. I'm not sure when I realized I was lost. At some point I knew I should have arrived at my cabin, but all I saw was white with a few slivers of gray swaying in the thick breeze. The hairs at the back of my neck became stiff and battered against me with every puff of air and every awkward crashing footfall. I was running out of energy, running out of ideas, and beginning to panic. I could have spun around in a computer chair 100 times and felt less disoriented than I did in that whiteout. Then I walked right into a cabin, literally. It had become so dark and the snow had become so heavy that I couldn't see the structure until I stumbled face first into it. I held my hands against the wood so I wouldn't lose it in the storm and circled around until I found a door. I wasn't just in a pinch, this was life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I knocked on the door and waited for an answer. Through the howling wind, I could have sworn I heard, "Come in." As I swung open the door and stepped inside, a small avalanche of snow tumbled in with me. I didn't bother trying to kick it out as I fought against the wind to close the door behind me. The relief was instantaneous. Without the air whipping at me, I'd put a stop to the timer ticking down to my freezing death. "Thanks," I whispered. I turned towards the inside of the cabin and tried to get my bearings, but all I saw was blackness, which meant I had no real way of gauging the size of the cabin. Yeah, I'd circled around it, but I'd been stumbling around, half blind, focused on trying to find a doorknob. So I had no idea what length of the cabin I'd covered. I could have walked half of it. I could have circled around it 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the vague outline of someone sitting in the corner. "Hey, you're a real lifesaver," I said. He didn't answer. I pawed around for a lighter, a lantern, a matchbook, anything that might emit light, but all my fingertips touched were chains and the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped poking around when I felt an open bear trap. Wouldn't want to get my arm caught in one of those. It was safer to sit still and wait for daybreak. It occurred to me that the stranger might have been seeking refuge as well, so I started, keeping my tone light and innocent. "You the owner of this cabin?" The answer was more of a hiss than a word, but in that hiss, I heard a faint yes. I sat on the floor, let my hairs down beside me, and reached into my pack. Why I'd taken a sleeping bag with me and not a flashlight was beyond me. I removed my wet clothes and quietly slipped into the sleeping bag to warm me up, making conversation as I did. "Hey, thanks again," I said. "That blizzard really came out of nowhere." He replied with the slow, labored, wheezy breaths of an elderly man on his deathbed. "Dangerous." "Yeah," I chuckled. "That's an understatement." "Hungry," he exhaled. "You got a fireplace?" I asked. "I've got a couple of hares. I'll cook them up. It's the least I can do." His reply was drawn out, like a wolf howling, but without the majestic hum. "No." "Okay, as soon as the blizzard dies down, I'll go gather wood and make us a fire. Can you wait until then?" I saw his silhouette shift slightly. There was a rattle of chains. "No." Again, the O stretched out in a long, bloated groan. "No. No, yes." The final no morphed strangely into a yes, like someone drastically changing to a much higher note on a flute, halfway through a breath. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black, or pitch white. It was like an afterglow, visible against the black backdrop of the wood, yet still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin because it was the only hint of light I could see. "If you don't mind, I'm going to try to catch some shut-eye," I said tiredly. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. Mountain folk don't talk much, even when they come down to town for what few supplies they can't make themselves. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I tossed my hairs back a bit farther and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't all that hard for me to drift off, despite the wind song playing outside the walls. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and drifted off. I was awoken by a different sound, a weird snapping crunch that made me shoot up in my bed. Believing the ceiling was about to collapse under the weight of the snow, I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me, but rather next to me, near my belongings. The silhouette was gone from the corner, and I could hear his deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with a rattling of chains. My adrenaline was pumping, and I wasn't even sure why. Something about the stranger put me in a state of near panic. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I truly couldn't afford it. Whatever this guy was up to, I was safer with him than I was out there in that blizzard. I grabbed my backpack and propped myself against the wall in a seated position, staring at the silhouette, expecting him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away, even as the howling wind slowly diminished in strength. Once or twice, I felt my head begin to dip and my eyes begin to shut, but every time I slipped, the faint rattle of chains snapped me back into consciousness. As the blizzard cleared and the sun slowly rose, light began to trickle into the cabin. The scene filtered through in tiny increments with each layer uncovered by the sun, like a printer slowly spitting out the full picture one line at a time. I wasn't even in a cabin. I was in a large supply shed that was maybe 10 to 11 feet long and 7 to 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which makes sense for a supply shed. There were tools, traps, and rifles lining every wall. The silhouette in the corner slowly stopped being a silhouette and started being a distinct person. Skinny. No, actually gaunt. Pale. No, actually ghost white. Man. No, it was a corpse. I was gutted. He was dead. Not, "Oh shoot, I died overnight. Sorry about that, dead." Like long dead. Long dead. His body was all shriveled and mummified, if that's even the right word for it. He wasn't wrapped up in bandages or anything like that, but his skin was completely dehydrated and stiff like an unwrapped mummy. His hair was hanging from his head in unkempt strings. His teeth were poking out of his shrunken lips, with a wide gap where the top right canine should have been. There was a stain of age-old blood soaked in the wood beneath him. I followed it by gaze to its origin, his left foot, and the bear trap in which it had been gotten caught. There was an empty hook on the wall above him with a chain leading to the trap. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough for him to reach the front door, or the saw hanging above it. My best guess was the trap had fallen on its own while he was out, and at some point he'd done a supply run in the dark and probably had gotten caught in his own trap. He probably died of thirst or something. Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing and he wasn't moving. He was dead as a doornail and had been for quite some time. I sat there, reasoning I'd been delirious the night before. The fatigue, the dehydration, the disorientation caused by the blizzard, it made me imagine a voice. Those slow hissing sounds I thought were replies were just the wind outside. I interpreted them wrong because the loneliness had finally gotten to me. The elements had conspired against me to create a living person out of someone who definitely wasn't living. It was a good logical explanation, and I wish I could say it was true.
Whenever I visit my family for the holidays, it always makes me depressed and stunts my creativity. One year, I decided to take an artist retreat from the week before Thanksgiving through the second week of January. It was a great excuse to avoid family, and it gave me time to do a couple larger paintings I'd been wanting to start. I found a small cabin way up in the mountains, right on a beautiful lake, far from the worries of civilization. There were only a handful of other cabins scattered around the lake, which were also short-term rentals owned by the same guy. I made a deal with him and got a good rate for my extended stay. The first month was amazing. I isolated myself in the cabin and made a lot of progress on my paintings. Whenever I needed fresh air, I would walk around the lake or hike through the trails in the area. I ran into the people staying in the other cabins a handful of times, which was a nice bit of human contact without taking away from my focus. After New Year's, though, no new guests came. By the 3rd of January, I was totally alone, or at least as far as I could tell. There were 10 days left on my reservation, and I was nearing completion of my last painting. I started to slow down and spent more time outside. Knowing I was alone made everything more eerie. I would come to learn the wilderness had more in store for me than I was ready for. I came back from an all-day hike to see tracks around the cabin. It hadn't snowed while I was hiking, so I first thought they were my own footprints. But when I looked closer, I couldn't remember walking where they were. The tracks came from the woods to the east, circled around the cabin, and then seemingly doubled back. I entered a trail heading west. The sun was setting and storm clouds were approaching, making it too dark for me to get a detailed look at the tracks. They were big enough to be humans, but for all I knew, they could have been from a wolf or a bear. Nonetheless, I followed the tracks until they disappeared into the woods. I didn't dare go any further. Entering the woods with no trail that close to sundown would have been a death sentence for me. All I could do was look around and peer into the forest, looking and listening for signs of life, but there were none that I could see. I became uneased, now more conscious of the dangers of my isolation. I was alone for miles, with no car, and only spotty cell service. I figured it was best I go inside. I got a fire going in the furnace and warmed up. By the time the sun was gone, the snow had shown up in full force. It wasn't the first snowstorm I had weathered in the cabin, so I knew I would be fine, but it still kept me on edge. At some point, I heard a noise from outside, like something had fallen over in the storm. I went to the window I heard it from and looked outside. I couldn't see for more than 4 feet, but there was an impression in the snow. It was a couple feet wide and about a foot deep. In my head, I could see that a wolf had been sleeping there, slowly being buried in the snowfall until it got up, leaving that hole. My blood pressure spiked. I felt as though I was being stalked like prey. I looked out the other windows, but all I could see were more tracks around the cabin. They were fresh, but the snow was quickly filling them in, making it impossible for me to tell what could have made them. All I could do was close the blinds and stay inside. I felt trapped. I wasn't enjoying my artist retreat anymore. I kept myself distracted until I could get into bed, but I couldn't sleep. I just laid there, listening to the storm. That's when I heard another noise, like footsteps on the porch. I listened until it stopped. Then I got up and went over to the door to look out the window. By the time I got there, whatever it was had left. I no longer felt safe. I stayed up for the rest of the night, paranoid, listening for danger. I was up all the way to dawn. When I finally stepped out to investigate under sunlight, there were no tracks, no signs of any animals or people, just mounds of snow over everything. I went around the cabin, searching for any signs that someone or something had tried to get inside, but all I found was one little scratch in the logs on the eastern side. I leaned down to inspect it, and discovered it was actually some sort of carving, a symbol, but I didn't know what it meant. Just then, a gust of wind blew at my back, making me turn around on instinct. I gazed through the trees intently, wanting and not wanting to see something at the same time. After about a minute, I was about to give up, but then I finally saw it. There was a face staring back at me. A wild face, but the face of a man, hairy and rugged, with no expression whatsoever. The rest of his body seemed completely camouflaged. I stared at him until my blood ran cold. Then, I slowly backed away and returned to the cabin. I immediately made arrangements to leave early, calling for a ride and packing up all of my things. I called the property owner and told them what I saw, but they had never heard of anyone ever being there except him and his guests. I had to wait all day in crippling fear until my ride finally came, just before sundown. I don't know who or what I saw that day, but I don't think I would have lived through the night if I had stayed. No research revealed anything helpful about that area, but I believe there's some kind of reclusive, unknown tribe of people living in those mountains. I think I overstayed my welcome and was marked for removal. I went on a winter trip with my friends a few years ago. There were 6 of us. We had a long weekend at a large cabin-style house in the woods at the base of a mountain. It was set to snow all 4 days. I'm not used to that, but my friends assured me we were well prepared. On the second day, everyone wanted to hike up the mountain after breakfast. I tried to caution them about how much snow was already falling, but I went with anyway. It took us a few hours to reach the turnaround at the end of the trail, where we took a break and ate a light lunch. The view was nice, but I couldn't help but worry about how windy it was up there. I tried to get everyone to start heading back after eating, but they wanted to wait longer. I was getting anxious and cold, but nobody else felt the same way. As I continued bickering with them, the wind started to howl. That wasn't the only thing I was hearing, though. Beyond that and the voices of my friends, I heard someone humming. I asked whoever it was to stop because it was too much, but nobody admitted to doing it, and it didn't stop either. I asked if everyone else could hear it, but they said no. I told them to stop messing with me, but nobody fessed up. I was finally over it and started heading down the mountain myself. Everyone told me to wait up as they started following me, but I was making a beeline for the house. Unfortunately, I was going too fast, so I tripped over something hidden in the snow and twisted my ankle. My friends helped me get down the mountain, but it hurt like hell, and I was pissed off. The next day, everyone wanted to go back up the mountain on a different, even longer trail, but I couldn't go with. Instead, I got some much-needed time to myself. I started out by getting the fireplace going and reading, and when I was bored of that, I hobbled over to the kitchen and started making a pot roast for when everyone came back. I almost chopped my finger off trying to cut carrots when someone pounded on the door out of nowhere. I was startled at first, but my next thought was that someone out there needed help, so I quickly went over to open the door, but there was nobody in sight. The only tracks I could see was the single group of my friends heading into the woods, and I couldn't get any text to go through to ask my friends if it was them. Right before I closed the door, I heard something that sent chills down my spine. It was that humming again. The same song as before. Without the wind, I could hear it better. It was a woman or girl humming some kind of creepy nursery rhyme, but I didn't recognize it. I called out to whoever was doing it, but I got no response. So I grabbed a can of bear mace and limped outside to follow the humming to its source. At first, it was coming from my left, behind the corner of the house. I went over there, but as soon as I looked around the corner, it was like they had just slipped behind the next corner. I circled the whole house, and this happened to me 3 more times. Then, I started to hear something else. Each time I took a step, I heard someone take a step right behind me. There was never anyone there when I turned around, and there were no tracks behind me other than my own. At this point, I thought I had to be going crazy, so I rushed back inside, with the sound of footsteps following me until I locked them out. I looked through the windows, but all I saw was the start of the day's snowfall. I had no choice but to move on and go back to cooking. Within the hour, though, everything was in the oven, and I was done cleaning up, so I had nothing left to distract myself. I kept watch like a sentry, but I couldn't see anything except snow and the overcast clouds that were making nightfall early. I worried about my friends too, but I was glad to be indoors. The storm only worsened with every minute. Soon, the wind was battering the house, frightening me with every creak and moan in the wood. I couldn't imagine anyone being out there in that weather, even with full winter clothing. But just then, I finally saw what I'd been watching out for. There was a little girl out there, all on her own, walking along the tree line and paying no attention to me. It was hard to see her, but she looked blue, like she was frozen or something. I couldn't believe it. Had she been messing with me all day just to get herself trapped out in the cold? I couldn't be scared of a little girl. I had to help her. I rushed over to the door, opened it up, and shouted at her to come in. But when I looked outside, she was gone. She just vanished into the storm. I kept calling out for her, knowing she still had to be close enough to hear, but she never came back. I was still at the door when my friends returned from their hike. They asked me who I was shouting to, and I had to tell them everything that happened while they were gone. They thought I was either messing with them or going crazy. The crazy thing is, I almost believed them. But as we were all eating together in the living room, someone started pounding on the door. I told them it was the same pounding as before, but this time, it wasn't stopping. One of my friends flung the door open, but once again, nobody was there. Now, everyone had reason to believe me, but nobody wanted to. We all stayed doubtful just to save our heads. Everyone fell asleep after a few drinks, but I kept watch all night. The next morning was our last day of the trip. We left a few hours early, and all the time that's passed, and even with all the thought I've given it, I've never been able to understand what happened to me on that mountain. My parents left me home alone to take my older brother to one of his hockey games. When I was younger, they used to force me to go with, but I had just reached the age they considered okay to be home alone for an evening. As I usually did when they left, I went to my brother's bedroom and started playing games on his computer. He never let me use it, sticking me with the old console in the basement that didn't have any games made after I was born. This happened years ago, but I'm pretty sure I was playing the latest Call of Duty at the time. So when I started hearing weird thumping sounds, I couldn't tell if it was coming from the headphones or real life. I kept pausing the game and taking them off to listen out for it, but I was never able to hear it precisely. I ended up assuming it was something in the game and started ignoring it. After about an hour, I took a break to use the bathroom. I had to walk past my bedroom to get to it, and my door was open. As I passed by it, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I did a double take and walked back, but there was nothing there. I could have sworn I saw a person outside my window, though. I went over and looked outside. Still no sign of anyone. It was getting too dark out. I tried opening the window, but it was frozen shut. Snow was starting to pile up outside, and the roof looked icy. I figured I was just paranoid because of the game. I continued over to the bathroom. But when I sat down on the toilet, I heard that weird thumping again. Now I knew it wasn't coming from the game. It was real. I heard the sound move, almost like it was over my head, going past me. Suddenly, I realized it was because someone was walking on the roof. I immediately got up and went back to my brother's room to grab one of his ice skates for self-defense. Then I called my parents. I told them what was happening, but they couldn't believe someone was on the roof in the conditions of that night. They told me to just make sure everything was locked up. So I went downstairs to check the front door. That's when I looked outside and saw someone climbing down from the roof over the front porch. They looked up and saw me when they were about halfway down, startling themselves so much they fell off. They landed in the bushes, which along with the snow, kept them from getting hurt. It only took them a few seconds to get on their feet and start running away. I freaked out and called 911. They sent over just one cop, who looked around and confirmed there were signs that someone had been walking around the house. but he said it was too dangerous for him to check the roof. I asked him to stay until my parents got home, but he got another call and left. I asked my parents to come home early, but they said that if the cops said everything was fine, and since this hockey game was so important for my brother, they couldn't pull him out. I felt cheated and angry, but most of all, afraid. I sat on the couch and watched TV at low volume, keeping an ear out for any more sounds. A bit later, my parents said they would be on their way home soon, but it would take a while for them to arrive. To me, it just sounded like they were saying they didn't care about me. That's about the time I heard another noise. I located it, seemingly coming from behind the basement door. I opened it up, making the sound clear. Something was scraping down there, but I was almost too scared to check. I forced myself to turn on the light and go down. On the basement floor, I looked to my left and saw through one of the windows that someone was digging through the snow. Before I knew it, they had cleared all the snow around the window. Then, they smashed through it with a hammer. I screamed and ran upstairs, locking the basement door. I called the police again, but it only took seconds before the intruder started pounding on the door. When they realized it was locked, they started breaking through it with the hammer. They soon pried open a hole big enough to look through. I could see their eyes, but a mask covered the rest of their face. I ran away, pleading for the operator to send more cops. I went into the garage, grabbed my mother's spare key, then jumped into her car and locked myself inside, hiding under the clutter on the floor. I was sobbing and begging, trying to be as quiet as possible, until they finally said they were sending someone. I waited in terror for over 10 minutes. I don't know if the intruder ever went into the garage or not. I stayed on the phone with 911 the entire time, until they told me to open the garage door for the cops outside. I practically ran into their arms. They said they had searched outside the house and saw the broken window. Then one of them stayed with me while the others went inside. They didn't find anyone, but there was a trail of melted snow leading up from the basement all the way to my bedroom. When my parents got home, the cops were still there. They looked so embarrassed. They apologized for not taking me more seriously. And on the surface, I accepted it. But honestly, I've never stopped being salty that they chose to stay at my brother's dumb game instead of making sure I was safe. I think the intentions of the intruder were quite clear. Nobody was ever caught. But I think it was someone from my brother's school who knew about me, and knew I would be home alone during that game.